Ethan Cole had lived alone on his ranch for almost 15 years. The land stretched wide and silent under the Wyoming sun, miles from the nearest town. His only company was his old horse, Dusty, a few cows, and the wind that sang through the open fields. He wasn't a bitter man, only quiet. Life had taught him to work hard, speak little, and expect nothing. Every morning he rose before sunrise, boiled black coffee, and walked the fence line. He fixed broken boards, fed his animals, and repaired whatever needed his hands. The work kept him busy, but when the sun went down and the sky turned red, loneliness crept in like the cold wind from the north. Sometimes he would sit by the fire, listening to it crackle, and wonder if anyone would ever sit beside him again. One evening, while in town to sell hay, Ethan saw a flyer pinned on the wall of the general store. It read, "Mail-order brides, honest women seeking good husbands out west." He read it twice, not sure if it was real. But that night back at the ranch, the thought wouldn't leave his mind. Maybe, he told himself, it was time to share his life with someone again. Someone who could cook, talk, smile, and fill the house with a voice other than his own. He wrote a letter the next week. His handwriting was rough, his words simple. He told the agency he was an honest man with land, horses, and a small cabin, and that he wanted a woman with a kind heart who wouldn't mind the quiet life. He sent the letter and waited. Weeks passed, then months. He almost forgot about it until one spring morning a letter arrived. It said his bride had been found and would arrive by train in 2 weeks. Ethan's heart beat faster as he read the words. He cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, polished the wood stove, and even bought a new dress from town, just in case she needed it. On the morning the train arrived, Ethan rode to the station early. His hands shook slightly as he held Dusty's reins. The train whistle echoed across the valley and his chest tightened with nervous hope. He hadn't felt this kind of excitement in years. The doors opened and passengers stepped out one by one. Then he saw her. She was small and graceful, her hair dark and neatly tied back. She wore a faded blue dress and held a worn brown suitcase. When she looked around, confusion showed in her eyes. Then she noticed Ethan watching her. She smiled nervously and spoke softly, but the words were strange. He couldn't understand a single one. Ethan blinked, puzzled. "Ma'am," he said kindly, "you're Miss Anna Thompson, right?" The woman tilted her head, trying to catch his words. She said something again, this time slower, but still in a language he didn't know. The station master walked over, holding a paper. "Looks like there's been some kind of mix-up," he said. "This young lady's name is Mei Ling. She's from China. The letter says she was meant for another rancher in Clearwater County." Ethan frowned slightly. "So, she's not the one?" The station master shook his head. "Afraid not. But her contact's gone missing, and she's got nowhere to go until the next mail coach comes through. That's in about a month." Ethan looked at Mei Ling. She was standing there quietly, clutching her small suitcase with both hands. There was something in her eyes, a mix of fear and hope. She had come halfway across the world, and now she was lost in a place where no one spoke her language. He sighed softly. "All right," he said after a moment. "She can come stay at the ranch until we figure things out." Mei Ling didn't understand the words, but when he pointed to the wagon and smiled, she nodded and followed him. The road back was long and dusty. Mei Ling sat silently in the wagon seat, holding her suitcase close. Ethan tried to speak using simple words, but she only looked at him with polite confusion. Still, he noticed how she smiled shyly whenever he caught her eye. Something about her calmness made the miles feel shorter. When they reached the ranch, he helped her down. She stood still, looking around at the open land, the wooden barn, the cows grazing in the field, and the endless horizon. She said something softly in Chinese, almost like a prayer. Ethan guessed it meant beautiful. He showed her inside the cabin. It was small but clean, with a warm fire in the stove and a bed covered with a handmade quilt. He pointed to himself and said, "Ethan." She hesitated, then placed her hand on her chest and said, "Mei Ling." That night, Ethan cooked beans and bread. She looked curious but grateful. She tried to say thank you, but the word came out strange and sweet. He smiled and nodded, pretending to understand. In the days that followed, their lives slowly fell into rhythm. Every morning, Ethan showed her how to fetch water from the well, how to feed the chickens, and where to hang the laundry. She didn't need much explaining. She watched and learned quickly. In return, she taught him how to cook rice in a small pot she carried from her homeland. She even planted a few seeds she had brought along, small green shoots that soon pushed through the soil beside the cabin. Though they couldn't talk, they found ways to understand each other. A nod meant yes, a raised eyebrow meant no. When he was tired, she poured him tea. When she was scared of the thunder at night, he added more wood to the fire so she'd feel safe. Their silence became a language of kindness. One night, a storm rolled in from the north. The sky turned dark and the wind howled around the cabin. Rain hammered the roof and the old barn doors slammed open and shut. Ethan jumped up knowing one of the horses might panic. He grabbed his coat and ran into the storm. Mei Ling, frightened, followed with a lantern in her hand. The rain poured down so hard it was difficult to see. The horse was kicking and snorting, tangled in its rope. Ethan tried to calm it, but the mud was slippery and he fell. Mei Ling gasped and rushed forward, shielding the lantern with her arm. She knelt beside him, saying words he couldn't understand, but her voice was full of worry. She tore her shawl and covered his head to keep the rain away. Together, they led the frightened horse back into the barn and closed the doors tight. They stood there, breathing hard, both soaked to the skin. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan started to laugh, a deep, quiet laugh from his chest. Mei Ling stared at him in surprise, then laughed too. It was the first sound of joy in that lonely ranch for years. They returned to the cabin, shivering but smiling. Ethan handed her a blanket and she made tea over the fire. He didn't understand her words, but he understood her heart. She was brave, gentle, and stronger than she looked. Over the next few days, things felt different. When Ethan went out to work, she would wave from the doorway. When he returned, she would smile and hand him a cup of tea. He began teaching her English words: sky, tree, water, and she repeated them carefully, pointing and laughing at her mistakes. In return, she taught him a few Chinese words, which he mispronounced but tried anyway. Each day, the loneliness in the cabin grew smaller. Each night, the silence felt warmer. Ethan had invited a stranger out of kindness, but something deeper had begun to grow, something that didn't need words to be real. Sometimes, as the sun set and the prairie turned golden, Ethan would look at Mei Ling working in the garden. The wind would lift her hair and the light would touch her face gently. He wondered if fate had really made a mistake, or if somehow it had brought her to the right place all along. That thought stayed with him long after the sun went down. Weeks turned into months, and life on the ranch slowly began to change. Ethan found himself waking up earlier, not out of duty but out of quiet excitement. He would step outside and see Mei Ling already in the garden, her hair tied neatly, her hands covered in soil as she tended to the small plants she had grown from the seeds she carried all the way from China. She would look up and smile at him, her eyes bright in the morning sun, and though no words were spoken, that smile was enough to fill the silence. She had made the cabin come alive in a way Ethan never thought possible. She hung her red scarf near the door, placed small bowls of flowers on the table, and cooked meals that filled the air with new, soft scents. He taught her how to make bread, and she showed him how to use herbs and rice in ways he had never seen before. Sometimes he burned things and she would laugh, a gentle laugh that sounded like wind through the trees. It was the kind of laughter Ethan hadn't heard in many years. He tried to teach her English words every evening by the fire. He would point at things, table, chair, sky, water, and she would repeat them carefully, her accent soft but clear. In return, she tried to teach him a few words in Chinese. He would say them wrong almost every time, and she would cover her mouth and giggle before patiently saying them again. Slowly, their words began to meet halfway, forming small bridges between two very different worlds. The townspeople noticed too. When Ethan came to town for supplies, folks at the store would whisper kindly about the quiet rancher and the foreign woman who had brought warmth into his home. Some people smiled, others were unsure, but Ethan didn't care what they said. All he knew was that his house was no longer cold, and his days no longer felt empty. One afternoon, while Ethan was mending a broken fence, he saw a horse approaching from the distance. The rider was tall, dressed neatly, and carried papers in his coat pocket. Ethan wiped his hands and waited as the stranger rode closer. The man stopped near the gate and spoke firmly. "I'm looking for a woman named Mei Ling. She was sent to me through the mail order agency. It seems there's been a mistake." Ethan's heart sank. He called for Mei Ling, who came out of the cabin with her shawl around her shoulders. The man dismounted and bowed slightly. He said her name and she froze. She looked from him to Ethan, confusion and fear in her eyes. Ethan stayed quiet, his hand resting on the fence post. The man, whose name was Mr. Hawkins, explained that she had been promised to him, that the agency had sent her papers by error. He had come to take her to his ranch several towns away. Mei Ling didn't speak, but Ethan could see her trembling slightly. Mr. Hawkins spoke kindly, but his voice was firm. "It's not right for her to stay here, Mr. Cole. She belongs with me by law." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to say that she didn't belong to anyone, but the words wouldn't come. He turned to Mei Ling, who was clutching her shawl, her eyes wide. She looked at Mr. Hawkins, then at Ethan, at the man who had given her shelter, food, and quiet kindness. Then she did something no one expected. She stepped forward, took Ethan's sleeve gently in her hand, and stood beside him. Her voice shook as she said, "Stay here." Mr. Hawkins looked surprised. "Miss, you don't understand," but she repeated a little louder this time, "I stay here." She pointed to the house, to the garden, to the land around her. Home. Ethan didn't breathe for a moment. Mei Ling looked up at him, her eyes full of tears but steady. Mr. Hawkins seemed to understand then. He sighed, adjusted his hat, and said softly, "Then I suppose the choice is made." Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and silence. For a long while, Ethan and Mei Ling stood there, watching the rider disappear down the dirt road. Then she turned to Ethan, her hand still holding his sleeve, and smiled faintly. "Mei Ling, Ethan's home," she whispered. Something inside him shifted that day. He didn't say anything, just nodded quietly and took her hand. They went back inside where the fire was still burning. For the first time, Ethan realized that home wasn't just a place, it was the person who shared it with you. Days became weeks again, and the ranch grew warmer with life. They built a small fence around the garden, planted more seeds, and painted the front porch white. Ethan carved a wooden chair for her, decorating it with flowers like those she had shown him from her homeland. In return, she sewed him a shirt from fabric she found in town, clumsy but full of care. They didn't need many words anymore. Their lives spoke for them. When the first snow came that winter, Ethan taught her how to make a snowman. She laughed like a child, running through the snow, her cheeks red from the cold. He threw a soft snowball at her and she gasped, pretending to be shocked before tossing one back. The sound of their laughter echoed across the quiet land. At night, they would sit by the fire, sipping tea and watching the flames dance. Sometimes she would hum old Chinese tunes and Ethan would close his eyes, letting the sound fill the cabin. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling. It was peace. Years passed quietly. They never had much, but they had each other. Travelers who came through often spoke of the American rancher and the Chinese woman, who lived in harmony on the prairie. Some said they spoke with their hearts instead of their tongues, and that their small ranch felt warmer than any other home around. Ethan and Mei Ling built their life together piece by piece. She learned to speak English better, though she still spoke softly and slowly. He learned to understand her silences, the way she smiled when she was happy, the way she lowered her eyes when something troubled her. Their love wasn't loud or full of big words. It was steady, built from small moments, cups of tea, shared laughter, and quiet evenings under the stars. One summer evening, as the sun went down over the golden fields, Ethan stood outside watching the sky. Mei Ling came beside him, her hand brushing his. Neither spoke. The air smelled of hay and wildflowers, and the world felt still. He looked at her and smiled, saying softly, "You know, I waited for a bride who could talk to me, but God sent me one who taught me how to listen." She didn't fully understand his words, but she smiled anyway, her eyes glistening in the fading light. She leaned her head gently against his shoulder, and for a long while, they stood there in silence as the stars began to appear one by one. Years later, when travelers passed through the valley, they would stop at the old ranch and hear stories of Ethan and Mei Ling. The house still stood strong, the red scarf still hung near the door, and the garden still bloomed with the flowers she had once planted. Some said you could almost hear laughter in the wind at night, as if the land itself remembered their love. Ethan had once lived a life filled with loneliness and silence, but that changed the day a lost Chinese woman stepped off a train, unable to speak his language. She had come by mistake, but she stayed by choice. And in that choice, both of them had found what they had been missing all along: a home, a heart, and a love that spoke louder than words ever could.